Success was never something that simply fell into my lap. I fought for it, every cent, every achievement, every small victory. I was born in a simple home where my mother spent days and nights working 2 jobs to ensure I had food on the table and books to study. I grew up watching her strength, and I promised that one day she would never have to worry about money again. I never gave myself the luxury of dreaming about fairy tales or waiting for someone to come and save me. From an early age, I understood that the only person who could take me out of that life was myself. I studied relentlessly, worked twice, as hard, specialized in the financial market, and before I even realized it, I was no longer the girl who saved coins to pay for college lunch. I had become Olivia Harper, one of the most influential executives in the investment sector. I remember the first time I tasted victory. My first big deal, a multi-million-dollar acquisition that brought in absurd profits for the company. Disbelieving, looks turned into looks of respect. And for the first time, I allowed myself to think that maybe I could have it all. Not just professional success, but a love that understood me, that admired me. That was how Ethan Callaway entered my life. We met at an investors' conference in Manhattan. He was charming, charismatic, and absurdly persuasive. A man who seemed to have everything under control, the type who commanded a room just with his presence. We became business partners first, lovers later. In no time, he proposed to me with a ring as dazzling as his promises of a perfect future. And I believed him. I believed him when he said he admired me, that together we would be unstoppable, that our empire would be eternal. We became a power couple. I brought the strategic vision, and he had the ability to deal with the big magnates. And for years, we were seen as the perfect combination. Then the signs appeared. Small at first, almost imperceptible. Avoided glances, phone calls he answered away from me, meetings canceled without explanation. But I had always been pragmatic, and I thought our marriage was no different from any other busy couple's relationship. I was never naive. I just chose to ignore the doubts, thinking they were mere unfounded paranoia. But what seemed like paranoia soon became impossible to ignore. The first clue came in the form of a bank transfer, a large amount sent to an account I didn't recognize. I knew every detail of our finances, and that was out of place. The second warning came in the form of a sweet perfume clinging to his shirt, a scent I had never used. The third and final blow came when I hired a private investigator. The evidence arrived in pictures. Ethan wasn't busy with meetings and business dinners. He was with a younger woman, a woman he was supporting with the money I helped build. He took her to the same places we had been together, bought her gifts, paid for luxurious hotels, and worst of all, he didn't even bother to hide it well. The moment I held those photos, I felt the air escape from my lungs. It was as if an invisible crack had opened beneath my feet, ready to swallow me whole. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't make a scene. I simply sat in my leather chair, looked at the images, and felt a cold rage growing inside me. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the humiliation. He thought I would never find out. And then, as if the universe wanted to test me, Ethan appeared. That night with a bouquet of flowers, a rehearsed smile, and an unexpected proposal. I've been thinking. I think we need some time for ourselves. No work, no pressure, just the two of us. What do you think about a trip to the Maldives? I stared at the face I once loved, searching for any trace of the man I thought I knew. There was nothing there but an actor playing his role. It was in that moment that I knew. He wasn't just cheating on me. He was planning something much worse, and I wouldn't miss the chance to find out. The invitation to the Maldives sounded too sweet. A sudden gesture of affection from Ethan, right after I discovered his betrayal, could only mean one thing. He wanted to distract me. He wanted to steer me away from any suspicion, to fill my mind with promises under a paradise sky while, behind the scenes, he continued his double life. I smiled and accepted, but inside, I was already watching. The days leading up to the trip were revealing. Ethan seemed far too eager to leave New York, as if something was about to explode and he needed to escape before the debris hit him. He insisted on handling every detail, booking the flights, making the reservations, planning the tours. His forced enthusiasm was almost comical. What he didn't know was that while he was rushing to organize his fake honeymoon, I was preparing myself too. With access to our bank accounts, I began studying the patterns of his transactions. Each day, more money vanished. Transfers to shell companies, exorbitant payments without justification. It was obvious that he was draining our assets before. The trip perhaps to ensure that when we returned, I wouldn't be able to track him. Ethan was a clever player, but he had one problem. He underestimated his opponent. I asked my lawyer to monitor our companies while we were away. I left clear instructions that any suspicious movement should be halted immediately. If he thought I was going to the Maldives blind and defenseless, he was very mistaken. The day of the trip arrived, and while he smiled in first class, I studied every detail of his behavior. He didn't seem like a husband excited about a romantic getaway. He looked like a man hiding a secret on the verge of being exposed. We arrived at the resort in the Maldives in the late afternoon, greeted with drinks and a cinematic sunset. Everything seemed too perfect: bungalows over the water, a turquoise ocean stretching to the horizon, a setting designed to make me forget any concerns. But I didn't forget. That first night, Ethan was too attentive to my mood. He touched my hand, looked into my eyes with that forced sparkle. He wanted to make sure his plan was working. We needed this, Liv. Just us, away from everything. I agreed, taking a sip of wine. I needed him to believe I suspected nothing. The second night was even more curious. Ethan received a phone call and left the bungalow to answer it. When he returned, I tried to pretend I hadn't noticed his tense expression, but something inside me knew. He was communicating with someone he didn't want me to know about. That was when a thought struck me like lightning. What if this trip wasn't just a distraction? What if he was about to get rid of me for good? The idea seemed absurd. Ethan was a scoundrel, a traitor, a manipulator. But would he have the courage to do something that extreme? Then came the third night, seaside dinner. Everything was flawless. The expensive wine, the well-prepared dishes. Ethan was more relaxed than ever, almost euphoric. The way he smiled, how he lightly touched my arm, how he looked at me as if he knew something I didn't. And then he said it, casually, as if it were just another outing. "I have a surprise for you tomorrow. A boat trip. Just the two of us, on a deserted island. You're going to love it." My muscles tensed, but my face remained neutral. Something inside me screamed, warning me that this wasn't just a romantic getaway. Ethan wanted to take me, somewhere no one would find us, and I needed to be ready for anything. The sea was calm that morning, a crystal-clear blue mirror reflecting the cloudless sky. The kind of day tourists dream of experiencing in the Maldives. But I wasn't a tourist, and this wasn't just any trip. The speedboat glided over the water as Ethan steered skillfully, a satisfied smile on his face. He seemed relaxed, almost too excited. No matter how hard he tried to hide it, his anxiety spilled over in the small gestures. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes darted toward me more often than usual, as if checking my reaction. I kept my expression serene, gazing at the ocean as if I were enchanted, as if it were just another perfect day with my perfect husband. The island emerged on the horizon, a small strip of land surrounded by palm trees and white sand. The kind of paradise you'd expect to see on postcards, untouched, isolated. There were no buildings, no signs of civilization. Ethan slowed the boat and jumped into the water, pulling it onto the sand. I hesitated for a second before following him. My feet sank into the hot sand as I scanned my surroundings. Absolute silence, only the sound of waves gently crashing on the shore. "So?" he asked, spreading his arms as if presenting me with a gift. "What do you think?" I forced a smile, trying to look surprised. "It's beautiful." He nodded, satisfied, and pulled a bottle of champagne from his pocket. He opened it effortlessly and handed me a glass. I accepted, but didn't drink. My instinct screamed that I needed to stay alert. The minutes dragged on. Ethan talked about how this was the perfect place to forget everything, to start over. But his eyes said something else. The whole time, he seemed to be waiting for something. Then he took a deep breath and stepped back, tilting his head slightly, like an artist, admiring his finished masterpiece. "You worked all these years just to support my mistress, you idiot!" My blood ran cold. The roar of the speedboat's engine sounded behind me, and when I turned, Ethan was already on board, his eyes gleaming with sick pleasure. Suddenly, everything made sense. The trip, the glances, the mysterious calls. He had never planned to return with me. There was never a second chance for our marriage. I was a problem that needed to disappear. I ran to the water's edge as he sped up. "Ethan." He just laughed. A dry, cruel laugh, as if he were enjoying himself. "Enjoy your stay." The boat disappeared into the ocean, taking with it any trace of civilization. I stood there, frozen, feeling the sun burning my skin as reality hit me like a punch to the stomach. I was alone, abandoned, and for the first time, fear threatened to consume me. My heart pounded, my eyes scanned the island for anything that could help me. There was nothing. No trails, no sign of people. Only the warm wind and the sound of waves crashing. I took a deep breath. Panic wouldn't save my life. Crying wouldn't get me out of here. If Ethan thought I would die like a helpless fool, he didn't know who I really was. With my feet sinking into the sand, I started walking. I needed to find something, anything. I wouldn't die on this island. And when I got out of here, he would pay for everything. The first thing I learned on that island was silence. An overwhelming, absolute silence, broken only by the sound of waves crashing on the shore and the rustling of palm trees swaying in the wind. I had never experienced anything like it before, the complete absence of another human being. It was as if the world had forgotten I existed, but I wouldn't forget myself. Ethan believed he had sentenced me to death. Maybe he expected despair to break me quickly, for the sun to scorch my skin, for fear to paralyze me until I became nothing more than a forgotten name in the records. He wanted me to disappear, and I knew that somewhere far from here he was, celebrating my absence. Bastard. My mind was still wrestling with the shock of being abandoned, but my body understood there was no time for mourning. Survival spoke louder. I started walking, ignoring the thirst burning my throat, the hot sand clinging to my sweaty skin. The first thing I did was assess the terrain. The island wasn't large but was dense, covered with vegetation in the center and a few rocky elevations. If there was anything that could help me, I needed to find it. I walked for hours, or what felt like hours. My stomach growled, my thirst worsened, but my mind remained steady. Then, I found my first glimmer of hope. Amid the trees, almost swallowed, by vegetation stood a small wooden shack, old and worn but still standing. My heart pounded. Approaching cautiously, I pushed open the brittle wooden door. The scent of salt and aged wood filled the air. Inside, the space was tight, an improvised shelter, probably once used by fishermen before being abandoned. But what? I found there was enough to reignite my survival instinct. A gallon of water, still half full. An old radio, possibly useless, but something I could try to fix. Some rusty tools. And most importantly, a small motorboat. My fingers traced the wooden hull, examining every detail. The engine was there, but I didn't know if it still worked. I stood up, taking a deep breath. Ethan left me here to die. But without realizing it, he had also left behind the key to his own downfall. The sun was already setting when I decided to test the engine. I spent the entire night working on it, disassembling, cleaning parts, trying to understand how it could get me out of there. The next morning, with my body aching, I sat on the sand and stared at the horizon. Ethan thought I was dead. He was probably already on his way home, returning to the life he stole from me, spending my money with the woman who was supposed to replace my existence. A cold rage ran down my spine. I wouldn't die on that island. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. When I got out of there, I would make him pay for every second. I took a deep breath and went back to the boat. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then, after hours of attempts, roared back to life. Ethan Calloway had just signed his own sentence without even realizing it. The sound of the engine tearing through the calm ocean was the soundtrack of my resurrection. Every wave I crossed took me farther from that sunlit grave where Ethan had expected my body to dry under the scorching heat. But I was alive, and he had no idea what was coming for him. The journey was long and exhausting. The sun burned my skin, the salt clung to my lips, and fatigue weighed on my arms, but I never faltered. At some point, I saw the first lights of a coastal city. It was like seeing civilization for the first time after an eternity in hell. As soon as I set foot on solid ground, I headed straight for the only thing that could reconnect me to my world: a phone. My fingers trembled as I dialed my lawyer's number, one of the few people I trusted completely. The ringing seemed to last an eternity before he picked up. "Olivia? My God, where the hell are you?" Alive. My voice was hoarse, dry, but filled with a burning hatred hotter than any thirst. "And I have a lot of work for you." It only took him minutes to confirm what I had already suspected. Ethan was in our house, manipulating the company's assets, draining my accounts, finalizing his preparations to ensure that once my name was officially declared missing, he would be the sole beneficiary. A newly widowed man, rich and free. But I was still breathing. Less than an hour later, I was already in a hotel, standing under a hot shower, feeling each drop wash away not just the grime of the sea, but the last remnants of vulnerability that had clung to me. Whatever was left of the woman on that island no longer existed. The Olivia that Ethan abandoned had disappeared. The woman now staring at herself in the mirror, sun-scorched, exhausted, but standing, was someone reborn through hatred. I grabbed my laptop and got to work. Accounts were accessed, bank transactions were tracked. With the help of my lawyer, every single financial fraud Ethan had tried to keep hidden was compiled into a dossier impossible to ignore. Evidence of embezzlement, document forgery, corruption, everything, waiting for the final blow. Ethan thought. He had left me with nothing, but he was foolish enough not to realize that while he was betraying me, I had always been one step ahead. My connections, my influence, my knowledge of his weaknesses were all intact. And now, they would be my weapons. While he celebrated his victory in his luxurious villa, beside the mistress he believed to be his new queen, I was pulling the rug from under his feet. The next day, as he raised a glass of champagne, certain that he had finally erased my name, from his life, a battalion of police officers stormed his house. The images spread through the media faster than he could comprehend what was happening. Officers rifling through drawers, seizing documents, sealing cars, freezing accounts. The empire he thought was his crumbled before his eyes. His phone rang. He answered with a voice full of rage, not knowing he was about to hear the last voice he ever expected in that moment. "You thought I was naive, didn't you?" The silence on the other end was so satisfying I could almost taste it. "While you were playing with your mistress, I was taking care of everything. I transferred your money to accounts that now belong to me, and I proved that all your wealth came from fraud. You're going to spend a long time in prison. And me? I'll be enjoying the life you thought was yours." His breathing grew heavy, I could picture him looking around, watching the chaos unfold in his home, feeling the despair creep in. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Exactly what you tried to do to me. Only better." I ended the call before he could respond. And then, before he could run, before he could think of any way out, the handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. Ethan Calloway was finally finished. But there was still one last loose end to tie up. The woman he thought would stand by his side. The news spread like wildfire. Ethan Calloway, real estate mogul, arrested for fraud and embezzling millions. The press dissected every detail of his downfall, while he, handcuffed and humiliated, tried to process how everything collapsed so quickly. But I knew his mind wasn't just on himself. There was someone else he had been counting on. The woman he chose over me. It didn't take long for her to do exactly what I predicted. The moment Ethan was arrested, she grabbed everything she could, luxury watches, jewelry, cash, and fled. Loyal while life was good, but the first to disappear when the storm hit. She took the first available flight to Dubai, trying to rebuild her life far from the scandal. But there was nowhere to run. I found her before she even had a chance to settle in. Tracking her was easy. Blocked credit cards, disposable contacts, a trail of rushed spending at a 5-star hotel. She had no idea I had already moved the right pieces. The authorities received the tip before she could even finish her first dinner in Dubai. Possession of illegally acquired assets, accomplice in financial schemes, frozen accounts, passport confiscated. She tried to fight it, yelled, threatened. But the hotel had already thrown her out. The stores no longer accepted her cards, and the so-called millionaire friends she had been trying to impress had no interest in sheltering a woman with nothing left. The paparazzi found her before the authorities could. Photos of her wandering aimlessly, lost, abandoned. The scene reminded me of the island where Ethan had left me. But there was one difference. I survived. She never knew what it meant to fight for something. She never knew what it meant to achieve success through effort. She had always lived in the shadow of someone else's wealth, waiting to be taken care of by a man who would give her everything without demanding anything beyond her looks. But when the well dried up, there was nowhere to run. Now, as I watched her downfall from a distance, there was only one final piece left to complete. Ethan Calloway was rotting in prison. The woman he chose was penniless, powerless, and without an escape. And me? I was exactly where I was meant to be. But there was still one thing left to do. My story still needed an ending. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange as I settled onto the deck of the yacht, feeling the salty breeze caress my skin. The same sea that had nearly swallowed me whole now stretched before me as a symbol of my victory. I was no longer trapped, no longer the betrayed woman, discarded like something disposable. Ethan Calloway had been sentenced to 20 years in prison. The trial was swift, leaving no room for appeals. The business world, which once worshipped him, turned its back on him without hesitation. Former partners denied any involvement. Shareholders dumped their stakes, and his company collapsed along with his reputation. The headlines showed no mercy. The man who had once been one of the most powerful figures in real estate was now just a convicted criminal, forgotten behind bars. I heard that in prison, he lost whatever arrogance he once flaunted. No money, no influence, no one to call up by. Friend. The kind of man who built his life by stepping on others always realizes too late that when they fall, there's no one left willing to offer a hand. The woman he chose to replace me didn't fare any better. After losing everything, she tried to find another millionaire to fund her whims, but her reputation was already in ruins. No one wanted to be associated with a broke opportunist. They say she still drifts from place to place, trying to find a way out, but she never manages to settle anywhere. For someone used to living off someone else's luxury, the emptiness of insignificance must be unbearable. As for me, everything was different. My life was no longer the same, and that was a gift. I returned home and rebuilt everything from the ground up. I didn't need to chase after what was already mine, just get rid of the rotten remains Ethan had left behind. I reclaimed control of my business, traveled to the places I had always wanted to without asking for permission, bought properties he would have died to own. But most of all, I learned to savor freedom. The Olivia Harper who once believed in perfect love and unshakable partnership had disappeared on that island. The woman now sailing through this ocean was no longer naive. I had become stronger, more calculated, and above all, the absolute master of my own destiny. I picked up the champagne glass beside me and raised it slightly, admiring the golden, liquid shimmering under the sunset's light. I toasted to my new beginning, to my strength, to my vengeance. And then, with a quiet smile on my lips, I murmured to myself, "Enjoy your stay, Ethan. I know I'm enjoying mine."